Hey everybody, Cynthia Allen, back at the Move Better, Feel Better Feldenkrais Awareness Summit, and I am so thrilled to introduce to you Tom Myers. Tom started out in the day in massage therapy. He studied structural integration with Ida Roth, of course, one of the huge pioneers in somatic education, and a contemporary of Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais. He studied anatomy with Dr. R. Lewis Schultz, and then human function or biomechanics, I would say more maybe, with Judith Aston. Yes, he studied with Moshe Feldenkrais 2 years in Amherst, as he will mention later. So maybe, these influences are huge, but maybe more important is what Tom has done with his work. He has continued to be passionate and interested in fascia, the human body, human function, relieving suffering, helping people, and has really developed his own work called Anatomy Trains. Now you're going to see here in a minute, I'm not interviewing Tom. And at first I was really disappointed that I wasn't interviewing Tom. But now that I see his presentation, well, I'm still a little disappointed because, a little bit of a groupie. I would have liked to have interviewed him, but hey, he put together a really stellar presentation for us. And I think anyone involved in working with human beings in movement or anatomy or body work will find the presentation stimulating, provocative. And I suspect even if that isn't your field, you're going to find it pretty doggone interesting. So tune in and I'll check back in with you on the back end of the presentation.
I'm Tom Myers. I'm very pleased to be here talking with you, Feldenkrais practitioners, about anatomy, which is my favorite subject, and the anatomy of fascia, which is even more my favorite subject, and something that I've been interested in ever since I studied with Moshe Feldenkrais. I met Feldenkrais first at Lone Mountain College. That's got to be back in 74 or 75, whenever he was there at Lone Mountain. And then we met again. I saw him and listened to him lecture then, but we actually met in London, probably in 1981, somewhere in there. And that caused me to come and take the first 2 years of the Feldenkrais training in Amherst, and I never completed that training. And rather than what I thought was going off into the Feldenkrais work, I took what I had learned in the Feldenkrais work and turned it back into my structural integration practice, my bodywork practice. And I remain having that bodywork practice until this day. I am the author of Anatomy Trains, and I do regard this as being an anatomy more suited to Feldenkrais practitioners. There's a great deal that is not covered in this, and we're not going to cover today, about neuroanatomy and all the things that you think about in terms of body learning. I'm going to talk about how the movement of the body interacts with the fascial system. That's all I'm going to cover within this hour, and even that, I could spend 2 or 3 hours on this, but we'll see what we can get through in the hour. The thing that I would like to start with is, are humans natural? I want to give a general anatomy lesson, then I want to go talk about the fascia a little bit, and then we're going to finish up with the anatomy trains, just so you know where we're going. But a little bit of the educational philosophy first. Are we natural? Are human beings natural? We're clearly animals. You have only to look slightly inside and see that our organs are arranged so close to a pig's that they use a pig's organs to practice for surgery. We have brains and gonads, and we poop and pee and eat just like any other animal. Clearly we are animals, so clearly we are a part of nature. So how could we be anything but natural? On the other hand, we all now live lives that are very divorced from the, call it what you will, I would call it a natural life, of 6 million years ago, 7 million years ago. A lot of this stuff is only 200 years old. But let's look at this. Let's look at this in terms of what are the things that make humans different from animals, and therefore, what are the things that have moved us away from nature and the natural? The first is that we stood up, as I am standing up now, as you stand up at the end of the lessons to take your walk to see what's happened. The standing up really was our revolution. It happened, we think, about 6 million years ago, although I was just reading some research that takes it back more towards 8 million years ago. There was Ardipithecus, and Ardipithecus is both the granddaddy of chimps and bonobos, as well as us, and that was an animal that walked on 2 legs. So, given that evidence, and the fossil evidence is really thin, so we don't really know. We make lots of suppositions on a very few bones. But for what we think now, that the line that ended up with chimps and bonobos was once a line that walked on 2 feet, and that humans remained walking on 2 feet, and chimps gave it up. That split, we think, occurred about 6 million years ago, so we've had 6 to 8 million years. That's 200,000 generations on the right hand of the side of the screen. That's not the number of years, that's the number of generations. So on the corner, on the order of 200,000 generations, we've gotten used to standing up. Why would standing up change our psychobiology or our sociobiology? Well, for one thing, you really have to straighten out the hip. So the hip in most of your 4-legged animals is flexed at a really strong angle. Think of your cat and your horse. The knee is right up under the belly and the femur flexed, and it extends, but it doesn't extend the way ours extends. It extends maybe back to here. Only those cavalry horses, the Lipizzaner horses in Vienna, still have that kind of idea. They were trained in battle to kick straight back, and they could really extend their hips. But mostly, if you have a canine or a feline or an equine friend near you, take a hold of their knee, bend the knee out around so that the femur is in the same line as the spine, and see how the animal feels about that. I bet you get a nonverbal message from that animal that doesn't like having the femur in the same line as the spine, but we hang out with the femur in the same line as the spine. So that's the major biomechanical change that happened from going from a 4-legged posture or a tree arboreal posture to a fully upright posture. The hip really extends more than any other of the mammals that we know. But what does that do? We didn't just put the leg behind us, we swung ourselves up on our hip so that the spine is vertical. Why does that affect our psychobiology? That takes the nose away from the ground. So our noses and smell isn't nearly as important to us, and we can't distinguish. I've forgotten how many smells we can distinguish. It's in the hundreds, and a deer is up around 10,000 or something like that. Very complicated noses with very, very refined scent things. Because their noses are close to the ground, they're picking up a bunch of scents that dogs and cats and rats are picking up, and we're not picking up because we took ourselves away from the ground. That allowed us to use the whole front part of our brain, what was called the rhinencephalon, because if you're going to detect 10,000 smells, you got to devote a large part of your brain to it. We only detect a few hundred smells, so we've focused the smell part of our brain down to here, and the rest of this we use as a filter. So, as a filter, yes, we filter out the sensations we don't want to feel, or that we've been feeling for a while and don't want to feel anymore. So, are you sitting in a chair? Are you aware of the chair that you're sitting in? Probably not until I draw your attention to it. You record the sensations of your sits bones on the chair that you're sitting on, or your back against the chair that you're sitting on, but after a while you don't record them anymore, you don't notice them anymore. You're still recording them, but you don't notice them because you're paying attention to my voice, you're paying attention to what you're reading, you're paying attention to what you're watching, whatever. But you don't have the sensations of your body anymore. That's a function of the filter in your brain that used to be your nose brain. Why does this make a big difference for us? We get really, really into the world we create inside, and we can put the world we make inside on top of the world that is outside. Animals may do this, but they do it in a much less of a way than we are able to do. We can forward plan a whole lot more than other animals, but we also have the ability not to pay attention to our bodies when we should. So that sensations of pain, sensations of non-movement, lack of sensation that might be noticed otherwise because of our human brains, because of the change that happened when we stood up, we don't pay attention to our bodies the way animals would. Second thing that happens when you stand up is you put the whole front of your body, that's the part that goes into the world. Well, that's the most sensitive part. That's the part with my genitals and my groin and my belly and my breast and my throat, all up front. So, as Feldenkrais and Rolf, both my teachers, said to me, that all negative emotion is expressed as flexion. That's a saying from Feldenkrais. A number of patterns involve protecting that front, particularly the startle response. So we'll see that later. The startle response is a shortening of the superficial front line in my language. We'll get to the anatomy trains at the rest of this. But we really took what was the soft underbelly of every organism, from a fish to a giraffe, and we made it, not the bottom of the organism, but the front of the organism. We go into the world with our most sensitive bits up front. We're either the most arrogant animal that you can imagine or the most silly to come in with our most sensitive bits first. But whether we're the most fierce or the most silly, when an animal is under threat, when a human is under threat, we see that shortening to protect these soft, sensitive bits in front. So this act of standing up, there's more to it. We're on a plantigrade posture, so we can't sleep standing up like a horse. That makes us with a very high center of gravity and a very small base of support. So that makes us inherently unstable. That affects our psychobiology. Our eyes were able to come together like a predator's, not sitting out to either side like a prey animal. What else happens? Oh, the diaphragm is operating up and down in gravity instead of back and forth in gravity, as it did for the last 500 million years or so, operating sideways in gravity. We somehow managed to make it work up and down in gravity. There's so many changes that come just from our standing up. But we've had 200,000 generations to get used to that change. There used to be old talk when I was first in my Rolfing training. Have we fully evolved? Has the hip joint fully evolved so that the low back can be? Yes, we've fully evolved. I'm sure that we're still in a process of evolution, but I don't think we're in a process, still in the process of standing up. My work, my experience with children is we're fully evolved, we can stand up. It's a matter of our use in the modern world. So let's take a step towards the modern world. The next big revolution that made us different from the other animals after standing up was the control of fire. Now, about 600,000 years ago, that's less than 1 million years of our 6 million years of walking around, somewhere in there, we usually, around 600,000 years ago, reliably find ashes in conjunction with human settlements, which means they had control of fire, even if they didn't know how to make it. First probably came control of the fire, and then came the ability to make it. But in any case, we don't know any other animal that controls fire. So that control of fire is really, it's represented in the lights that I'm looking into. That's an expression of fire refined into our modern era. But what happens when you can control fire? Well, for one thing, you're not so scared. You can sleep in the cave at night, secure that the saber-toothed lion is not going to come take you, because 2 people stayed up to be the watch guards, and when the saber-toothed tiger comes along, they take a branch out of the fire and wave it in the saber-toothed tiger's face, and he goes off in search of some easier prey. So everybody gets to sleep safe. And the second thing that happens around a fire, talk. We developed our culture around a fireside. I'm pretty sure of that. Can't prove it, but every time people get around a fire, they sing and they dance and they talk. And it is that social bonding and the social contract that comes about over whoever is controlling the fire. That will really suffice up until we get to a mere 600 generations ago, about 10, 12,000 years ago, and a lot less time than that for most of humanity. We went from gathering our food to growing our food. That involved a huge difference in our nervous system, in our society. The Hindu, what do you need when you have agriculture? You need soldiers to protect the land. You need serf farmers to work the land. You need landowners to own the land. You need merchants to sell the produce. You need storage places. There a whole bunch of stuff comes along with our, you'll excuse me putting it this way, our slavery to our grown food. There is an argument that wheat, cotton, and rice enslaved human beings in order to make more of them. That's a wheat, cotton, and rice point of view on the world, not a human point of view on the world. But there's an argument to that we used to work a lot less. If you go to hunting-gathering cultures, even those that had fire, they don't work the number of days that we work, the number of hours per day that we work, or the number of days per week that we tend to work. So the amount of work gathering your food in a Paleolithic society was a lot less than the amount of work gathering your food in an agricultural society. But nevertheless, we made that shift and we grew our food, and that allowed a class society, and that allowed cities. Before that, you couldn't have, when you're a hunter-gatherer, you can't have a group of any more than 25, possibly 40, that could live off the land in one area, no matter how rich that land was. So usually if groups got to be over 20, 25, they would split into two, and some would go off somewhere to look for some other place to live, because you need a big area to support a hunting-gathering society. You can't have cities until you have agriculture. That really separates us from the rest of the animals who, as far as we know, don't grow their own food. They gather their food. Then, a mere 20 generations ago, we step into the industrial era, and with the industrial era, we really change our movement and change our bodies again as we start to think of ourselves as machines, and we build ever more complicated machines, and we're still building ever more complicated machines, and those machines are doing the work for us. We're using those machines to dig stuff out of the ground. That's the sun's energy wrapped up in oil, wrapped up in wood, wrapped up in coal, and we're unspinning that sun's energy in about a century. We're burning it off so fast that we're changing the atmosphere, and we have changed our own lives because so much work is done by gasoline, done by this conversion of sun energy, that we don't expend our own energy, so we don't have to move in the industrial era the way they had to move in the agricultural era and the way they had to move in the hunting-gathering era before that. The industrial era allowed us to travel, but travel by sitting down more than travel by walking. And really, the fifth step away from naturalness is the electronic revolution that has overtaken us in the last couple of generations. And a great deal of it has happened in the last, when was the smartphone delivered? Around 2008, 2009, something like that. So it's really been in the last 10 years that the electronics revolution has gone like this. And now we really have to argue, what is the effect of that on human learning, on the body itself? The fascia is what I'm going to talk about. But I really commend to you the work of Yuval Harari in *Sapiens* and his other books. He explains this out much better than I can. But I've kind of gone over the same points that he has in terms of these 5 revolutions that I think have moved us away from naturalness. Now, of course, we're still natural, but we're living in an environment that we created ourselves. That is really a significant thing for an animal to do. A snail makes its shell, a mouse makes its den, but we have recreated the world that we live in for most of the time. I live out in the country in Maine, and yes, I get outside into the natural world, but even so, as a modern human, I spend a lot of time on email, a lot of time on my phone, and a lot of time indoors. We have created the environment that we live in. Only corals do that. Corals create the environment that they live in. But we have done it to an extent now that is really strong and really commands us to study Feldenkrais, to study yoga, to study personal training, to really study how we move, because for the first time in history, we do not have the demands to move upon the body. We may not have enough demand to move on the body to keep the body healthy. So we're looking at that, we're all looking at that in a great big experiment I call spatial medicine. So if we look at spatial medicine in prehistory, we can say that let me recalibrate Maslow's hierarchy of needs here to say that we seek safety first. If you're safe, then you can be hungry, or then you can seek to satisfy your hunger with food or drink. And that when you have eaten, that you then tend to seek contact or comfort. That's the hierarchy. If you're not safe, you're not comfortable, and you're probably not going to stop to eat. But then when you get safe, you look for food. When you've gotten food, you look for contact or comfort or belonging in some way. And so we go through all of these kinds of experiences, and if the experiences are good, we tend to stay in what Stephen Porges calls the ventral vagus of social engagement. We're alert, we're interested, but we're also not scared, not trying to get away or anything like that. When survival gets threatened, and remember, we're so subject to our internal environment that we got when we stood up, that we can get fear and lack of survival going in our internal environment, even when it isn't presenting itself to our external environment. So you can have somebody coming into your office who is acting as if their survival is threatened, even though their survival isn't directly threatened. It's indirectly threatened through their brain, and it's expressing itself, we'll talk about that, through their movement. So traditionally, you can do three things with that. You can confront it, fight. You can avoid it, flight. Or if it's overwhelming and you can neither fight it nor flee from it, then you submit. The submit part is coming from the old dorsal vagus, and if you think of a caterpillar curling up in a ball, that's about what that dorsal vagus, submission, apathy, freeze responses, all of these manifestations are manifestation of a system that has been driven so far into its primitiveness that it has essentially shut down those parts that would reach out. You know somebody is getting better if they are in one of these apathetic submission states. You know they're getting better when they start fighting you, when they get angry at you, or they get angry at somebody else, or they start having that energy coming up. The energy of submission of apathy is no energy at all. So don't be worried when somebody actually comes up against you and starts to snap at you. That's a sign of their returning health, not a sign that you're personally offended them or something like that. Get yourself out of the way and look what's happening to their nervous system, because that's an improvement in this kind of case. Now, what can you do with this? Well, time immemorial, we have been training young people to accept life as it is and the burdens of adulthood, and we have been healing people where it's gone wrong. In terms of spatial medicine, in terms of the body, there were all kinds of different trainings. Folk dance, of course, was the clearest training that inculcated everybody in the tribe into the same mindset, into the same rhythms with the year, sometimes the same rhythms of the month, a la the red tent. But if you look, there have been trainings going on forever. Martial arts is perhaps the first one to prepare for war. Sport is the little brother of war, right? So sport is a way of preparing for war. And folk dancing and martial arts and yoga. I think those are the ones that I can think of that go way back. In terms of going way back, in terms of healing, of course there's herbs and all of the things that go on the chemical side, but in terms of the body structure, there's really massage and bone setting. Now, bone setting has its modern form in chiropractic and osteopathic work, but massage has any number of different types. And I would put Feldenkrais somewhere in between the two. It's kind of an internal massage that you do with yourself. FI has elements of massage, but it's mostly in the realm of training, isn't it? It's training the neuromuscular system, and I want to talk to you about what happens with the fascial system when that neuromuscular system is trained. So I'm not trying to offer an alternative. I do fascial manipulation. I'm not suggesting that you should do that. I think it's great that you're doing Feldenkrais. I just would like to talk about the fascial portion of what's going on when you do that practice. Before we get into the fascia specifically, I would like to give you a general anatomy lesson out of my studies over the last, these many years, since I was over in, where was it? Somewhere in Southern California for the Feldenkrais training, and then in Amherst. Since that time, I have just immersed myself in anatomy and thinking about it in slightly different ways. I've got this little water snake from or I don't know what they call it. It's this kind of funny balloon that's really hard to keep hold of because there's water inside it and skin on the outside. And what I'd like you to notice is skin on the inside. And in between is the fluid parts with little bits of plastic in it for this one. Now, why is this an anatomy lesson? Because God loves tubes. So we're going to look at how the body is constructed out of tubes. Now, you might think that you have a digestive system in order to fuel you that runs around. I assure you that in evolution, it was the other way around. Your digestive system invented you. So I'm going to start with this 30-foot tube of the digestive system. That was by far the earliest tube. In fact, if you want to touch the earliest part of you, do this. Go beyond your gag reflex. There in the pharynx, that is the oldest part of you, the part that grew forward into your head and backwards into the rest of your body. But right there in your pharynx, that is a very, very old, it's been there for a long, long time in your evolutionary history. So we could call that a tube, right? It starts with the lips and goes to the anus. There are 7 sphincters along the way, dividing this muscular tube up into bits. But I want to just spend a little bit of time with this tube. On the inside of the tube is endothelial cells. These are in the large class of epithelial cells. These are in a large class of cells that are really good at absorbing things from the outside and secreting things into the outside. So all of your glandular cells are these epithelial cells, and all the linings of everything, the lining of all of your tubes, your arteries, your capillaries, your lymph vessels, your lungs are all lined with these epithelial cells. But definitely the first ones to come along are your gut. Now, around that is a mucosal layer with lots of mucus production in it and lots of nerves in it, the submucosal layer. After we have this level of epithelial cells, we have a level of submucosal plexus is in there, so lots and lots of nerves, but loosely wrapped around this tube, and lots of mucus-producing cells in there. We'll talk about mucus later. And then there are 2 muscle layers on top of that. One muscle layer that is like a ring that squeezes the fluid along in peristalsis, and then muscles that run along the same line as the tube. And then outside of that, outside of the muscular layer, is a tunic. The tunic goes around the stomach, around the duodenum, around the small intestine, around, and it comes into something called the mesentery, which joins the gut to the back, hangs the gut off the back. Of course, we stood up, right? So we're now still hanging, come back here, hanging the gut off the back, but now we've taken the back up. That does occasion some problems sometimes when the guts are not pulling properly on the back, or we don't have the proper support for our guts, because instead of hanging off our back where our back is the ridge pole, it's hanging off our back when our back is the tent pole. So this 30 feet of muscular tube was the first tube in your body. Now, if you looked at an earthworm, that tube, your neural tube and your structural tube are all the same length if you were a night crawler, right? They're all exactly the same length. But in a human being, the gut is 30 feet long, let's say 8 meters long, and the spine is only 1 meter long. So you have to stick 8 meters of this muscular tube onto 1 meter of spine. So it's a pretty straight shot. Say the letter G. That's where your gut attaches to the bottom of your skull in the back of your mouth, and that goes all the way down to the anus, right along the front of the spine. But the esophagus goes right along the spine too till it gets to the stomach, but then it starts curling this way and this way and this way and this way. So you've got, I don't know, it depends on the person, but on the order of 27, 30 feet of gut tube for a 6-foot person. Around that tube, you built 3 sets of tubes. You, meaning your mom, God, evolution, Charles Darwin, whoever you think is doing these things. In the course of evolution, the original tunicate that is essentially just a pharynx grew 3 tubular systems on its back. Now, the first of those tubular systems is the one that you work with a lot. It's the nervous system. Were there nerves around the gut? Yes, there were. Is there a second system of nerves? Yes, there is. That's the central nervous system. I'm putting it above here because we're looking at a fish. Of course, if we were looking at a human, this would all be back to front, but it all comes from the same vertebrate body plan, which is the gut on the bottom and the nervous system on the top. Now, the nervous system is fundamentally a tube. It's a tube, it's got ventricles in here, and it's got a spinal canal going down through the middle of it almost all the way, well, it goes down to about T12L1, but all the way down the central nervous system, you have a tube. Evolution had already made a tube. It said, okay, we're good at these things, let's make another tube. So it made a tube of highly sensitive tissue at the back of the organism. It was so fast and so highly sensitive that it developed these sensors, and they moved to the front of the organism. Your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your nose, they're all at the front of the organism. Your vestibular system, they're all up there at the front of the organism because you want to be able to react quickly to what's coming at you. So it's a logical place to put all those sensors. So you'll see that the nervous tissue has really, the tube, the neural tube, has really gathered up at this end in your big old brain. So much so that it's pulled the spinal cord all the way up to T12 here, and the rest of it is the cauda equina going down from there. Okay, that's one tube. That tube sits on top of the next tube, which is the spinal tube. I can jump back on stage with this spine in my hand. Now, this may not look like a tube. Here you can see the yellow nerves coming out of the foramina. And when I talk about the spinal tube, I'm not talking about the hole down through your canal in the back, the spinal canal. I'm talking about the body disc, body disc, body disc, body disc, body disc, body disc. This was the original tube of your spine. Well, the original tube of your spine was actually one long disc. I really think this is important for Feldenkrais practitioners to understand that the fundamental unit of the spine is not the vertebra, it's the disc. The disc is the original material. The body of the vertebra is a Johnny-come-lately, very cancellous, very blood-filled bone, but the discs are much tougher than we thought they were. They don't pop like balloons. They don't slip. They can't possibly slip. They're not a separate piece of plastic like they are in this spine. They're bonded right to the body. They can't slip out of the way. What they can do is if you have a hitch in your get-along, you can go like this and grind, 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 grind away at one of those discs until the annulus is so thin that the nucleus pops out through the skin of the annulus. Not very much fun to have a protruding disc or indeed a herniation, or at worst a rupture of the disc. But it's good to understand that the discs are really, unless you drive your motorcycle into a cement wall, it's really hard to pop a disc from the odd accident. But it really comes from wearing the disc away from just small mismovements, small mismatches of movement within your body, the kind of thing that you're working with in the Feldenkrais. So here's the second tube of the body, and right underneath it, no diagram for this, is the aorta, and that's the third tube. So I've got a digestive tube, I built a neural tube, a structural tube, and a circulatory tube over the top of that. And each one of these systems, as you can see in the slide, from that central tube spawns a system that goes body-wide. There are 3 systems that if I could make them everything invisible except for that system would show us the shape of the whole body. The nervous system, the circulatory system, and the fascial system. Now, the circulatory system is our body's clock. It's also our body's alarm clock, right? If something strange happens, boom, your nervous system gets very alarmed very quickly and gets you up in the fight or flight in the sympathetic stimulation. So your nervous system is the timing device of your body and also setting up for alarm. The circulatory system is what takes things from outside to the middle and the middle to the outside in the unceasing metabolism of life to build proteins, anabolism, and to break them down, catabolism. All of that goes on and on and on and on and on, and it has to happen through the circulatory system to take food from your mouth and your lungs and end up with pee in your bladder. That is the results of the metabolism of 70 trillion cells going along. Now, I'm not going to. I know that you're Feldenkrais people and you work with the nervous system, and I know that you've got a lot of people talking to you about that kind of learning. I really would like to focus just on this third system, which is the fibrous system, the one that we often call the musculoskeletal system. But musculoskeletal leaves out the system that connects your muscles and your skeleton. In fact, is essential to understand the musculoskeletal system is to understand the fascial system. So the rest of this will mostly be about the fascial system. So you're probably familiar with pictures of the nervous system from Alex Gray, from what we just used from Andreas Vesalius, and used to pictures of the circulatory system, again, either out of Vesalius or out of the body worlds, or recent exhibitions where they have injected the arteries and the veins with latex or something so that you can see the circulatory system in all its glory. What we haven't got after 500 years of Western anatomy is a picture of the fascial system. There are reasons for this. It's technically very hard to do, number one. It's underway now with the Plastination project in Germany, but still very difficult for them to do. And absolutely impossible for the old anatomists of the 15, 16, and 1700s to do. Secondly, it's a context, it's an environment. We didn't even invent the word environment until Marshall McLuhan came along in the 1950s. And so we didn't see the fascia of the body because it was the environment, the context for everything else. So you'll excuse me if I don't call it the musculoskeletal system. I'm talking about the fibrous body. Muscle fibers, yeah, but we know about muscle fibers too. We're really going to talk about the fascial fibers. And so it consists of, the fibrous body consists of the fibers of collagen and elastin and reticulin and the glue of all the glycoaminoglycans like heparin and hyaluronan and leptin and all of the different things, all of the different sort of mucousy gels that pervade the water of the myofascial system. But if we looked at it, it's absolutely body-wide. There's no part of the body except the open lumens of the digestive tube and the lungs that don't have any fascia in it. Even blood is liquid fascia. Even blood has a viscosity to it, has elements of the fascia running around in it. And even lymph, which has almost no elements of the fascia running around in it, still contributes to our structure by giving turgor pressure to the cells and holding us up. So we are held up by the pressure of the liquids, fluids in our body, because the gases have something to do with it, And we're held up by the gels, the sort of semi-liquid fascia, and then we're held up by the sinew, what we've thought of as fascia, the fibers in the fascia. But please don't call this the musculoskeletal system. That's fascia dissing. So let's call it the neuromyofascial web. It's important when you look at this web in terms of body learning. There's something I'd like to say here, because I don't think we're going to be able to get to it in detail within the hour, because I really want to focus on fascia. But that is, your nervous system is listening to your fascial system and talking to your muscular system. Robert, whom I think spoke to Robert Schleip, whom I think spoke to you before, and I did a back of the envelope figure. It's somewhere between 6 and 10 times as many receptors in the fascia as there are in the muscle. And even the muscle spindles are not measuring. They're measuring what's going on in the muscle, but they're measuring it by measuring what's going on in the fascia. I would say all the body receptors in your body are fascial receptors, but I'll cover my behind by saying, oh, well, muscle spindles, about 1/6 of them to 1/10 of them are muscle endings, and the rest are fascial endings. Free nerve terminals, Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini endings, Golgi tendon organs. I'm sure that Robert was fulsome on what these endings are doing. All I'm going to say is it's a very rich delving, listening of the nervous system into your fascial system to hear all kinds of stretch computed, converted into pressure and shear and load and length. But it's a stretch activated system. All of the nerves that are feeding your brain from the fascia are feeding off some form of stretch. But we have ways of converting vibration and pressure and shear into stretch reception so that we can feel it. But your fascial system is very richly innervated. But as far as we know, no nerves, no motor nerves go to the fascia. Fascia cannot actively contract. It's not designed to do that. There's a special case of myofibroblasts, and they come into play without nerves, and I'm going to leave them for another day. But you'll really not go wrong if you think your brain is listening to the fascia, and based on what it hears on the fascia, it sends messages to the muscles to adjust the forces that are going on through your body that the fascia can handle by itself. In other words, if I want to reach over and open this doorknob, I'm going to be able to do so until I get to the edge of my quadratus lumborum fascia here, and then I'm going to send messages to the muscles to adjust it so I can get over there to open the mailbox or whatever it is. So the way that I'd like you to see this loop is that the body listens to the fascia, puts it through its worldview, sends it back to the muscles. So all the patterns of tension in the body are, at basis, neuromuscular patterns. There's long been an argument. I remember, I'm going to tell you a story now. I went to Ida's birthday. I've forgotten which birthday it was, 81 or so. Maybe it was her 80th birthday party. Anyway, it was at the San Francisco Yacht Club, and it was the year of the Lone Mountain, one of the years of the Lone Mountain college training that Feldenkrais did, the first training he did in America. And so Moshe showed up to Ida's birthday. So there's Ida decked out, a lei of white flowers around her neck, and she couldn't stand having all this personal attention on her. That was not her. She was not an egotist, and she was very uncomfortable with all of us praising her and clapping for her and being the center of attention and all of that. So in walks Feldenkrais, wearing the same clothes he's been wearing for the last 6 weeks, and Ida was so overjoyed to see him. Her face lit up. She dragged Feldenkrais over into a corner, and they stood over a table as if they were looking at something, I don't know, probably looking at her new book, and talking and talking and talking for 2 hours. Nobody had any, here we were at a party with both Ida Rolf and Moshe Feldenkrais. Nobody said a word to them because all they did was stand in the corner or with their backs to everybody else and talk and talk and talk. They were 2 peas in a pod, I must say. I really enjoyed both of them for different reasons. And they were famously feuding about Ida saying these patterns are trapped in the fascial system and Moshe saying they're trapped in the nervous system. And I want to be really clear, they're neurogenic, they're neuromuscular-genic. You can't send patterns to the fascia. You can send patterns from the brain to your muscles. Okay, here's what happened in my house. My father would snap, so we were always watching for what, was going to happen before he would snap. Does that have something to do with my short-sightedness? I don't know, but it certainly had something to do with going to here. And then I got to be 6, and I went to a school, and I sat at a little middle desk, and somebody said, "Tom," and I went, "Yeah." And so then you build yourself in with a flexion pattern in the thoracolumbar spine and a hyperextension pattern in the cervical spine. That's neuromuscular. Now, if I'd had an accident or an operation, we could say, okay, that's fascial. Trauma coming in could be directly fascial, and then the neuromuscular system has to respond to the fascial restriction that a surgical operation or an accident has put upon you. But that's not the majority of what you're working with. The majority of what you're working with are neuromuscular patterns. So ours was not to breathe. Everybody in my family had to learn to breathe again because you didn't want to breathe too loud. You didn't want to set Dad off, especially on Sunday afternoon. So we would all be really quiet. So that quiet was built into my neuromuscular pattern. Here's what happened. The neuromuscular pattern, once it's been around for a while, the fascia says, well, the fibroblasts within the fascia say, okay, if you're going to hold your body like this, then we're going to take the pelvis forward and tighten up the fascia on the back of your legs in order to keep you up in that position. So it starts out being neuromuscular, then it gets written into the fascia. Now, a Rolfing point of view to that would be, you gotta get the fascial open before you can get the neuromuscular to come around right. That would be the argument of those of us who work with the fascial system to release that system first. The argument of the folks who work like Traeger or Feldenkrais or a number of training methods would be, we're going to retrain the neuromuscular system and then that will retrain the fascial system. And I think that's true, but the fascial system is the slowest dray horse of the body systems. So it takes a long time for that fascial system to change. So you change the somebody is standing and they're standing in a pattern like this, and you change the neuromuscular system so they can more stand like this, but the guy wires of the fascial system, the elastics, are tending to take them back into the position. That's a good time to refer them perhaps to a Rolfer or somebody who's working, a yoga teacher, somebody who's working more in the fascial realm. You can keep doing your FI and ATM lessons until the fascia comes around right. But I think you're fighting an uphill battle with that. However, I have to turn when I have my audience of Rolfers, I have to say, you can't just smoosh the body into shape and expect it to stay that way. There are patterns in the nervous system. Those patterns must change if the fascia is going to stay changed. So you can change the fascia, but that doesn't guarantee you a change in the movement pattern. You can change the movement pattern, but that doesn't guarantee you a change in the fascia. I hope that the practitioners of the future will be working with both. And we're doing so much research, we may find more intelligent ways to work with both in the future. For now, there's this kind of dichotomy. How much of the pattern is written into the fascial system? How much written into the nervous system? It's something that we're still struggling with, both on a professional level and on a research level. So here we are with patterning in the neuromyofascial web. This person is patterning themselves through many hours of sitting at the computer, but just substitute sitting driving, sitting in an airplane, or any of the other patterns that we characteristically take. They will involve neuromuscular patterns at the first, and then that will involve changes in the fascial system and can involve eventually changes in even the bone in the skeleton itself, depending on the age of the person. The skeleton inside, the structure of the skeleton is subject to change. Now, look at this woman. She's upright, ready, looks strong. She happens to be, I know, a karate teacher in New York. She's a very good karate teacher. I would want her on my side in a fight. But I just invite you to look at this photograph from the point of view of her rib cage. So we see this is the same photo. All I did was tilt the photo until the rib cage was straight up and down. So now if you look back at the first photo, you can see, oh, the rib cage is leaning back. The head is upright on top of the body, the pelvis is under, ready for the body, and just the rib cage is leaning back a little bit. Watch what happens when I shift my body so that my rib cage is straight up and down. Then you can see, oh, my pelvis is really retracted and my head is really projected forward. But I disguised all that by leaning my rib cage back. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, straighten up your rib cage, because the other parts of the body don't stay still when you do that. It's a whole pattern. It's a pattern of the whole. And we are in that distinction that we made at the beginning between bits and the whole. We have to study in bits, but we have to perceive in terms of the whole. So you can't just take the rib cage of this woman and say, ka-chunk. Now, I also invite you to notice that in the standing photograph, she looks, and she is, very toned, very ready, a spring ready to go off. If you look at her with the rib cage straight up and down, you see the scared little girl that caused her to be a karate teacher in the first place. She didn't solve the I'm a scared little girl pattern. I was about to say problem, but is it a problem? It's just a pattern. Okay. Didn't resolve the scared little girl pattern. She simply compensated for the scared little girl pattern. And it's me being judgmental to say it's a scared little girl pattern. I have seen this enough, so I'm reasonably sure of what I'm talking about. But it may not be. This is my surmise. But if you look at the photograph from the point of view of her rib cage, you see a head projected forward in fear. You see a pelvis retracted in fear. The fear part is my judgment that I'm adding on top, but that's because we're just doing an hour course on video. And we really have to change not just the angle of the ribs, but the angle of the neck and the head in relationship to it, and the angle of the pelvis and the femur in relationship to it. It's a whole pattern that is asking to be changed, not one element in that pattern. Change one element in that pattern and you may find that you have a Jacob's ladder that is making effects all up and down the body. I'm sure you've experienced this in your Feldenkrais practice. Okay, so if we look at these two women here, we can begin to unravel these patterns in terms of what we call body reading or visual assessment. And I don't know how much you do this inside your Feldenkrais training, and you may do it more in movement. We, being static kinds of people, tend to do it in posture because we're looking at what we would do to change the guy wires on that posture. You're looking more at functional integration. By the way, that was another Ida Moshe thing. If she can call her work structural integration, then we can call our work functional integration. That was an early statement of Feldenkrais in there. So it was a wonderful friendly rivalry between the two of them. But if we look at these folks, we can see the patterns in the rib cage. If you look at the woman on your right, you can see that she is folded in on this side. Is this a neuromuscular pattern or a fascial pattern? With the presumption that it's been there for a long time, with the presumption that she's already a gyrotonics teacher, I happen to know, that she's already done work on her body. It's both, of course, a neuromuscular pattern. If it's been there for a few months, it's also a fascial pattern. If it's only been there for a couple of weeks, it's only had time to be a neuromuscular pattern. But you leave it there for a few months and the fascia forms around it. So then you have a pattern in the body that is fascially held, and if you put them on their side and try to open between the ribs and the hips, you'll find that resistance there, and some of that resistance is neuromuscular and some of that resistance is fascial. How much is what? Well, we can continue that friendly rivalry between Feldenkrais and Rolf until we arrive at the place where we are the most effective for all the people who come to us. Everybody has their skills and talents. Nobody has a skill and talent that serves for every person in every situation. So I refer to Feldenkrais practitioners, I refer to Tai Chi teachers, I refer to acupuncturists and Pilates teachers and all kinds of things depending on what the person needs. And I would urge that with you too. Feldenkrais will solve a lot of neuromuscular problems. Feldenkrais results in an improvement in the integrity and coordination of the movement, no doubt about it. But there may be things like leftovers from surgical scars, abdominal adhesions, or results of trauma, or things that have been in there for so long. This one, for instance, if I could maintain this position for the next few months, which I really wouldn't like, my anterior longitudinal ligament would shorten along the front of my spine, and it's not a neuromuscular event anymore to open this up with a back bend or a bridge or any of the other things that open up the front of the spine. It's going to take time. The fascia is slower to respond than the nervous system. Let's now talk for the rest of the time about the fascial system per se. One is, if you look in the anatomy books, all you're going to see is the generic fascia, if they leave any fascia at all, because they tend to move the fascia out of the anatomy books. But if you look at this slide, you can see that it's very individualized. Here is a heavier fascia from upper left to lower right than the other way around. And that means that that person, maybe they were a bus driver and spent all day with the left hand going like this, so that the forces coming across this way were stronger than the forces coming across this way. I don't know. We don't know much about the people we dissect in terms of their life histories, but here you can clearly see, and we often see in the dissection, differences in the fascia that will never show up in the books because the books are averaged numbers of corpses and they don't put the things in there that aren't average. But what are you looking for? You're looking for the things that are individual to that person so you can undo that pattern. So the things that you see in the anatomy books are not going to show you these individualities in the fascial system. Second thing I'd like you to notice is that the fascial system extends into the bones and the cartilage. This is controversial in that the standard definition of fascia is only the soft tissues, but if we're talking about the entire extracellular matrix, I would urge you to look at this inside the bone. This is the fascia inside the bone, and this bone has been treated by this lab that I visited in Germany to remove the calcium part of it and only leave the fascial part of the bone. So you have the collagenous part of the bone in there, but your real bone, well, it's not as bendable as that femur is, but your real bones are more bendy, more resilient than the bones that you find in the woods. One more thing about the fascia is here you can see from this slice through the lower leg that the fascia distributes itself almost like the veins of a leaf in a very, very organic way through the muscle. So you can see, I think, the two bones in blue and the interosseous membrane, this very thin but strong fascia running in between, and all the various muscle groups, including the Achilles tendon in a deep purple on the left-hand side, and the peroneus longus, fibularis longus tendon on the upside, and the various muscle groups around the lower leg there. But look at how the white lines, the white is fat, but it's associated with the fascia, go into the muscles in a leaf-like pattern. That's how the muscles pull on the fascia. That's the tendon in the middle of the muscle. But it's also the way in which blood vessels and nerves get into the fascia, into the muscle. They use that fascial scaffolding as a way of getting themselves in close to all those little muscle fibers so they can fire them off. I had not seen this design inside the muscles until I saw this picture, and I am just so looking forward to more and more good representations of what's going on in the body, both fascially and with the other tissues. So, because the more accurate our picture is, the more refined and sensitive our hands can be when we go in to look with that tissue and change it. So the fascial takeaways that I would have you take with you is, one, that this system has been considered dead, and it's not. It's alive. It's a very responsive system. Sure, the collagen is not part of a cell. The mucoids around the collagen are not part of a cell, but they were all made by cells, and they were made by cells in response to chemical and mechanical signals. So as far as I'm concerned, your fascial system is alive, even though it's often registered as inert tissues in the atlases. We just want to know that as the nervous system is, the fascia is unitary from top to toe. It's never separated. Well, you can separate it with a surgeon's scalpel. You might contuse it with some kind, or break it with some kind of accident. It will get frayed with age. That's what's happening on my face. And still in all, when I draw my last breath, it will be a unitary net from top to toe, birth to death, left to right, and what did I leave out? Front to back. It's all one net all the way down your body. Second thing we need to know about fascia is that it transmits force, and that the body is a force distribution machine, not a force focusing machine. When we focus the forces, we get injured. When we distribute the forces, we stay safe. So distributing the forces around the body is a big function of the fascia, and we now know it doesn't go directly from origin to insertion. We thought all the force from the origin would be transmitted to the insertion, or the other way around. Doesn't work that way. Lots of force is distributed sideways through the bones, through the soft tissue into the bones, and things are transmitted vertically. That's what we're going to look at with the anatomy trains. Thirdly, the fascia responds in many ways. The fascial properties that anybody who's working with the body needs to know is the fascial viscosity. The fascial elasticity is another property. The plasticity that we engage in my Rolfing work or in yoga, and to understand how the system remodels after training, even after a Feldenkrais lesson. It's important to understand how that system remodels. I hope you'll join some of the other webinars that we have on our website where I explain all these things in greater detail, but right now I'd like to go on and show you some stuff from the fascial system. But the last piece that I would like you to know, particularly as Feldenkrais workers, is that most of your body sensing is fascial. We already said this. It was 6 to 10 fibers in the fascia for every 1 in the muscle. And the second thing is, most injuries, I'm talking particularly about chronic injuries, have a strong fascial component. What doesn't heal is usually the fascial part of it. That can involve the nerves, scrunching the nerves up in the fascia, and often causing scar pain, etc. But it is the fascia that, it's fascial injuries, tendon injuries, cartilage injuries, ligament injuries that tend to persist because the fascia is so slow to heal. And there are ways in which we can speed that healing and ways in which we can unspeed that healing. Again, something that's a little too much for this hour-long course. Let's go on now and look at the anatomy trains. If you take in this idea of the fascia going all over the body, you will be impressed, I think, with the idea of tensegrity. And the things that I've been involved with in terms of myofascia is looking at the anatomy trains, which are the, we could call them the elastics going around the body's tensegrity. If you like the idea of tensegrity, we certainly have that available at anatomytrains.com if you'd like to go and see that webinar. But if we look into dissection here, if you'll excuse this dissection picture, we've made an opening here between the pectoralis and the deltoid, and I'm reaching down underneath the pectoralis major. So if you know your anatomy, that's in between the pectoralis major and the pectoralis minor, and everybody knows that we get to the outside edges of that muscle, and what? I put my finger down through here, and you see what happens. I meet a wall of fascia that's going from the pectoralis minor around to the pectoralis major. It's not in any books. Once you get really used to it and you look in Netter, I'll show you where it is inside Netter, the connection between the pectoralis minor and the pectoralis major. But most of your muscle anatomies don't show it. You don't see the fascial body, therefore you get a skewed idea of how the musculoskeletal system works because you don't have the fascia that connects in between it. How does that make a practical difference? It makes a practical difference here when you're looking at restrictions in the arm, that working on the pectoralis major can help the pectoralis minor. Of course, I'm going to talk in terms of fascial terms and in terms of putting my hands on the body because that's what I do, but the same thing would apply for movement. Can I separate out the movement of the pectoralis major from the pectoralis minor? You can. We'll get into that as we move on. But I'd like to show you the method by which we get to the anatomy trains, which is simply by turning the scalpel sideways. By turning the scalpel sideways and looking in terms of myofascial connection, it's possible with regular dissection to connect the trapezius to the deltoid, to the lateral intermuscular septum, to the extensors on the back of the arm. Just go up your arm like this. You've just traced what I'm showing here. Trapezius, deltoid, lateral intermuscular septum, extensors of the body that connect the midline of your spine to your fingernails, or as I call it, the superficial back arm line. Now, the superficial back arm line is one of 12 anatomy trains. I don't know why there are 12. 12 is what I've discovered so far. There may be more. But these are common pathways for myofascial force transmission, transmitting stability, but also compensation, shock. They transmit force wherever that force is coming through. And they're not the exclusive ways in which force is transmitted in the body. They're just common ways in which force is transmitted in the body. Now, most of what you know about muscles turns out to be wrong, and we'll blame the Europeans because of a European mistake 470 years ago in 1540 when Vesalius was first cutting up the body. They used, Leonardo and Michelangelo used the tools of a hunter or a butcher to cut up the body and to see what was inside. And it's such a mess of fascia in there that they found muscles. They cleared all the fascia around the muscles and said, see, we found a muscle. It originates here and it inserts there, and therefore it does this. We have all of our muscle analysis is based on a single muscle theory, the isolated muscle theory. If I took everything off the skeleton except the biceps, what would it do? Well, it would be a supinator and an elbow flexor and some kind of weak shoulder, diagonal shoulder flexor, and we say, okay, that's it. We know about the biceps, and we walk away. But the biceps is also part of the deep front arm line, which goes from the thumb through the biceps under the pectoralis major to the pectoralis minor. In other words, connecting the sternum to the thumb. This is part of what the biceps is doing. It's not enough just to isolate the muscles on the body and to understand the function there. Muscles connect through the fascial straps, or meridians as I call them, across the body, and considering how these things run can really help you make an analysis of those postural patterns that we've been looking at before. Whether you think of them as neuromuscular or fascial, or as I do, neuromyofascial, in other words, the whole thing all together, being able to see the pattern is the first step to being able to resolve it. Now, I'm not saying you can't learn things from individual muscle theory. Here you're seeing 4 individual muscles, the psoas, the iliacus, the obturator internus, and the piriformis, and understanding those 4 individual muscles can really help you understand the motion of the sacroiliac joint and what's happening in gait. I'm not saying you can't learn anything from studying the single muscles. I'm saying you can learn something additional from studying the anatomy trains, and people have been doing research on this, and they did, with a straight leg lift test, show that, read the chart here, you can just stop the webinar if you want. 2.5 times as much strain is going through the iliotibial tract. So are you measuring the hamstrings or the ability of the hip joint to go into flexion, or are you measuring the ability of the iliotibial band to move? And you can see that the force from a straight leg lift test is distributed all around the body in varying ways. So it's not enough to know muscles from origin to insertion. Here you can see all the anatomy trains that we were able to dissect out of one person. Now, I'm sorry, this looks a bit like a butcher shop. This is untreated tissue. This tissue was frozen and then dissected, unfrozen to be dissected. So it's as near to living tissue as we can get without hitting our students over the head and putting them down on the lab table. So in this way, we see the fascia much closer to its living state. And in this, we have taken out the trains that I'm about to show you on a skeleton and a model so that you can see how they run. To let you in on the anatomy trains, we're here with Emily, local yoga teacher, dressed entirely in Lululemon, so I hope we're getting some kind of product kickback for this. But let's build the anatomy trains, which is, where do we have muscles and fascia strung together like strings of sausages or long straps of fabric going up the body in a continual way? Let's start with the back one, actually. Could you turn your back to the camera? And if you lift up your foot, we can put this all the way underneath with the red TheraBand representing the plantar fascia running from underneath the toes to the back of the heel. But the fascia keeps on going right around the heel and then becomes part of the Achilles tendon, is one with the Achilles tendon, which widens out with the soleus until it gets to the gastrocnemius. And the gastrocnemii are interacting, excuse me, Emily, with the hamstrings, almost like a square knot, the way the hamstrings are wrapped around the gastrocnemius heads in the back. But it is fascially continuous and forcefully continuous all the way up to the ischial tuberosity, and underneath her gluteus maximus is the sacrotuberous ligament, which carries us up on the sacrum and onto the back muscles, and the back muscles obviously are a fascial continuity all the way up to the nuchal ligament at the nape of her neck, but the fascia keeps on going all the way over. Can you turn sideways without losing that thing under your foot? Going all the way from toes to nose up the back of the body in one myofascial continuity. As you can see here, we've dissected it out. We've dissected this out many times, and other labs have dissected it out. So I'm reasonably sure that this is a real myofascial continuity from your eyebrow. And keep turning back to the back again, because there'd be one on the right and one on the left all the way up. Now, when you engage in a forward bend, you are going to challenge or ask this line to lengthen. Now, it may be the bottom of the foot that stops you from going all the way. It might be perceiving to you in the hamstrings, but that may not be what's actually stopping your body from moving forward, because all these things are connected from bottom to top. So the superficial back line unfolds us from that embryological folding up into a full maturity and turn sideways. The significance of that is that we have that it goes over all the primary and secondary curves. Here you can see primary, then there's a secondary, then there's a primary, then there's a secondary, then there's a primary, then there's a secondary, then there's a primary, then there's a secondary in the arch. So as you can see, this back line goes over all the primary and secondary curves and really has to do This is a little bit subjective, so you don't have to believe this part. But in my world, it has to do with maturity. When I see lack of balance among these primary and secondary curves, I am thinking, that person didn't unfold into maturity in a way that really suits them. There may be many reasons for that, but I would observe that in the balance between the primary and secondary curves in the superficial backline. Now, go ahead and face them if you would. Because up the front of the body, starting at the top of the toes, but I'm going to tuck it under her toes just so I have something to hold it here. Going across the top of the foot, you can feel all those tendons. It's great if you want to feel along with us as we go up. All the tendons that run along the top of the foot run here under a retinaculum. So I would have to have a strap that would hold down here. What's going to happen is what would happen if you didn't have a retinaculum, which is all these tendons would pop out away from the body. But they're held in by a piece of the sock called the retinaculum. And from there, we go all the way up to the tibial tuberosity on the tibialis anterior and the toe extensors. And that gets us into the knee bridle and the complex of the, just hold that right on the bone just under, so that you can see the superficial front line going from the top of the toes to the hip. Now, the superficial front line is in two pieces, so I'm not gonna, but I should snip this here, and then we put the second part. You can go ahead and hold it on your pubic bone, and that will run up the front of the body until we get to the collarbone. And then what keeps going on the superficial part from here? The sternocleidomastoid. So now if you can keep that under your foot and turn sideways, because a lot of the effect of the superficial front line, remember we talked about this earlier, is we have all these sensitive bits on the front line, so that if we go into a pattern of fear, shut yourself down into exhale, that's going to pull down and make straight this superficial front line. So this is such a common response to fear. It's not a white male pattern, it is a mammalian pattern. So when you go into a back bend, you're going to challenge this line. If you take your head into utter hyperextension, you're actually going to shorten this line up here. So you don't want to do that. You want to be reaching out with the back of your head as you go into a back bend. Obviously, this is not a great position to go into a back bend, but you can see how any bridge, cobra, any of the extension moves would challenge this line and exercise the back line. So the front and the back line balance each other, counterbalance each other, but they don't do it terribly well because the front and the back of the body are very different. If we look at the anatomy of the two sides, as we're about to next, the anatomy of the two sides is very similar, right and left, but the front anatomy and the back anatomy is very different. One is full of slow twitch fibers and has to do with our maturity, and the other one is full of fast twitch fibers and has to do with our patterns of fear. It's, again, worthwhile looking at these things as one big whole so that you understand them. Now, just turn sideways to them if you would, and we'll stick this under because this line really starts here at the inside arch, and I need another little retinaculum to hold it behind the ankle so that you can see the fibulari muscles, fibulari brevis and longus, coming out around the outside arch, the outside of the ankle, and up the outside of the leg. Now, that distinguishes itself from the superficial front line, that this is anterior compartment here, and the superficial back line, which is this big soleus gastroc compartment here. The lateral line is this little fibulary compartment that comes along here all the way up to the head of the fibula. So if you strum on the outside of your leg, you will feel guitar string out here. That guitar string is what you want. Just go way up on your toes. So that muscle that sticks out here is not the lateral line. It is not her fibulary muscles. That's her soleus muscle. Come on back down again. This is the fibulari actually in this valley here. They're very tight. They often feel like guitar strings. They're helping to hold you up. And that indeed goes into the iliotibial band. And I want to be able to widen this out because the iliotibial band widens out to the front and the back of your pelvis. Thus, the lower part of the lateral line looks like the letter Y and has a lot to do with your stability as you're walking from one side to the other. The lateral line, however, continues right on up through. Now, I can't go through your arm, so we'll go around front, but it's coming all the way up to the ear here. If it looks like the letter Y down below, excuse me, I'm going to go over here. So if we look at the lateral line on the skeleton, it's certainly this Y shape from the ASIS and PSIS all the way down to the outer arch, and you use that with every step. Go feel your 6-month-old. She or he won't have an iliotibial tract. You make the iliotibial tract in the act of walking. You form your fascia by your movement. Now, what happens to the lateral line above the iliac crest is a series of X's. On the one hand, it goes up. I could diagram it as a line by just going up here from iliac crest to ear. But that's not how it works. It's out on the edges of the levers, right? It has to work like an accordion on the outside edge and the inside edge. So it's a series of X's, internal oblique and external oblique. Internal intercostal, external intercostal, X, 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 all the way up to the last one, which is the sternocleidomastoid and the splenius capitis, which make an X in the neck, and really helps control the movements of the head, allows the movement of the head, actually allows the head to stay still while the body moves underneath it. That X of the lateral line is really helpfully responsible for that. Now, having all these X's along the outside of the lateral line allows the body to rotate in gait, rotate in running, and then the lateral line, those intercostals, act like a watch spring. Tick, 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 tick. You use the elasticity of the tissues. The lateral line, obviously, is going to determine lateral symmetry, and the lateral line on this side is going to allow me to bend to the right. The lateral line on this side is going to allow me to bend to the left. Are there other structures in the body that are part of that lateral field, part of that side bending field? Yep. The scalenes, quadratus lumborum, etc. are not in this line. They're in the deep front line that we'll get to in a minute. But this lateral line is that outer stability system that registers differences right to left. Postural differences right to left and functional differences right to left. If we've seen, I call them the cardinal lines, north, south, east, and west, yes? Front line, back line, lateral line, lateral line. Then we have the last of the superficial lines, which is the one that goes around the town. So if I start with that splenius capitis, didn't you use the splenius capitis in the lateral line? Yep, it's used in both the lateral and the spiral line. Didn't you use the sternocleidomastoid in the front line? Yep, it's used in both the lateral line and the front line. That means that those two lines are related to each other, and a head-forward posture like we saw with the karate teacher would affect both lateral and front lines, right? All the lines affect each other, but if you could slowly turn away and move your feet too, you can see the splenius capitis, and can you now hold this up here with your hand, going over to the rhomboids on the other side. I have dissected this. It really is connected with a piece of fabric across the spots and underneath. I can't put it underneath the scapula, but it would go underneath the scapula to the serratus anterior. Keep going. External oblique on this side, internal oblique on this side. Can you see that we've been able to draw, some people have called it a serape of or a sash of myofascial fabric that goes from the right side of the head to the right hip by means of the left shoulder and the left rib cage. Watch what happens to her posture as I pull on this, right? So rotations and things that result from rotations are the very common things that involve the spiral line. We would hope that this spiral line would be able to stretch when she did a twist to the left and would be able to be engaged when she did a twist to the right, and the very opposite would apply to the hopefully equal and opposite line that's going from the right side of her head to the right hip by means, the left side of the hip to the left hip by means of the right shoulder and the right rib cage. Especially when you start in on the spiral line, it's like, which one is left? It gets confusing about left and right. That's the upper spiral line. We often treat it separately from the lower spiral line. The lower spiral line it's actually all one piece, but hold that to your ASIS. The anterior part of the iliotibial band goes fascially right into the tibialis anterior, which hooks to that peroneus longus, which goes up the hamstring to, now I'm going to get you to turn around, to the ischial tuberosity. So the lower part of the spiral line is a jump rope that goes from the front of the pelvis, where she's holding the band, to the back of the pelvis, where I'm holding the band, by means of the arch. And this is going to tilt your arch inside. If this gets too short, tilt your arch outside. If the part she's holding, pull up on that. If that gets too short, that's going to tip her foot out this way. It also affects the knee. To go into all the details here is too much. Okay, we'll take this out. But the spiral line is a really interesting line in terms of gait and obviously in terms of the twists that some people hold in their body. Now, if those are the cardinal lines plus the spiral line, with the arms, we get 4 lines, and I'd like you to lean forward if you would and just put your arm out here. The reason I'm having you lean forward is so that it more closely approximates the wings of a bird. So I showed you a dissection of the superficial back arm line, which is trapezius to deltoid to lateral intermuscular septum to the extensors along the back of the arm. This is the part that holds your arm up all day over the keyboard, but it would be the equivalent of the back of the bird's wing. On the front of the bird's wing, coming from the, yeah, you can go ahead and hold that. Coming from the tendons of your fingers across the palm, through the carpal tunnel, up the flexor group to this little intermuscular septum that goes up the inside of your arm to the pectoralis major and the latissimus, and this would go across to the same one on the other side. So this is the business part of the wing. It's connected to the pectoralis major and in us to the latissimus dorsi all the way around here to the back. So even though it's the superficial front line, it has a muscle that goes to the back, and this is where the power of the wing is. Think of the difference between a chicken wing and a duck wing. There's different types of power for different types of birds, but for us, the power that comes from throwing comes from this, come on up, comes from that line. We mentioned it, a deep front arm line that comes from your thumb. You can hold that up. We're going to turn your arm this way. Yep. Up the radius to the biceps, and then under the pectoralis major to the pectoralis, sorry about that, the pectoralis minor and the subclavius, but I wanted to show that it's going deep. This is the deep front arm line. It's named for what happens to it in the axilla, and in the axilla it goes deep and hugs onto the ribs with the pectoralis minor and the subclavius muscle. And then finally, if I can get you to turn the other way, just so that the camera can see it, and again, holding your arm out this way, if we started from the little finger, and I'll just let you hold that between your little finger and fourth finger, we would include the muscles at the bottom of the little finger, climb up this fascia to the point of the elbow, go up the triceps to the rotator cuff, and having gone through the rotator cuff, we would join ourselves to the axial skeleton with the rhomboids, and get this out of the way, with the levator scapulae. So levator scapulae and rhomboids lead to the rotator cuff, lead to the triceps, lead out to the little finger. So the top, the bottom, the front, and the back of the bird's wing, that's the easiest way to remember the arm lines. The anatomy of the arm lines is fully as complicated as the legs. Arms work pretty well because we use them so much, much better than legs that we put our feet in sensory deprivation chambers and walk around in them. So that they don't have the use that the arms get. So shoulders have lots of injuries in them, but arms and hands have a lot less use injuries. Why? We use our hands more than we use anything. Yeah, we use them so they're well in our brain and ready to be well used in a neuromuscular way. Our feet are stuck up in those shoes all day and they just don't work as well. So there's lots of problems with shoulders and how shoulders sit on ribs, but there are fewer problems until you're working with musicians, that kind of thing, with the musculature and the coordination of the lower arm and hand. I find it curious that we don't have more problems with the hand, and I think it's because we use the hands so much. All right, if we want to extend the arms to the opposite leg as you would in a throw, right? If I throw with just using my arm lines, I'll be accused of throwing like a girl, something that we would never do these days. Make such an accusation, I mean. But if you're really going to throw something, male or female, you are going to pivot off the opposite hip and use your whole body as the lever that is going to throw this through. What is the anatomy involved in that? This is very simple. You have seen this before. If I pick up from whatever arm line I'm using, if I were throwing a ball, I'd be using the superficial front one. That would be the pectoralis major. That goes into the external oblique and the rectus abdominis. I'm going to ask you to hold this on your pubic bone so that then we can track the adductor longus going to the back of the femur on the opposite side. 1, 2, 3, or 4 structures, goes right through the middle of the pubic symphysis over to the other side. This is the front functional line. It's what Mézières called the ligne de fermeture, line of closing. And Andre Fleming has called it the anterior oblique sling. I'm not the first person to discover this line. It is the way that we, and of course there would be an equal and opposite one on the opposite side, but this is the way that we join contralateral girdles. And if you turn around, there is a similar X on the back of the body formed by the lat leading to the gluteus maximus, leading, well, across the thoracolumbar fascia, leading to the gluteus maximus, leading to the vastus lateralis that takes us all the way around to the knee in 1, 2, 3, 4 structures. We're all the way from the tibia on that side all the way to the shoulder on this side. And obviously an equal and opposite one on the other side that makes an X that crosses the body approximately at L5S1. Now, these, you can see that these are used reciprocally. If I was throwing a ball, my right back functional line is shortening right now, the left one is lengthening, but when I throw the ball, those two are going to reverse. The left one is going to shorten, the one from the left shoulder to the right hip will shorten in the back, and the one from the right shoulder to the left hip will lengthen out until it acts as a brake, a B-R-A-K-E, to save my shoulder joint when I'm throwing. So the functional lines, as I call them, or anterior and posterior oblique slings, as Andre Fleming calls them, there's an X across the front and the back of the body that join the contralateral girdles. And you use those lines, again, those that are in constant use don't get that many problems with them, and the functional lines generally come along for the ride of whatever the spiral line and deep front line that we're about to do are doing. But you will want to functionally watch how these are moving, because none of us, well, very few of us are equal on our right and left sides. Most of us have a dominant side, and therefore that ends up affecting this a lot. All right, that was it. One more line, and that is the deep front line. So go ahead and face them, and we'll do a combination of this and the skeleton, because I want you to see that this is going to come up the inside of the ankle. It is tied into the arch. This deep front line is what is my bid for what should be called core, and this goes up inside the ankle and then up the inside of the calf. But let me have this for a second, because I'm going to put it on over here so that perhaps they can see a little bit better. So can I ask you to hold this on the deep in the arch there? Because that's the tibialis posterior, and the long toe flexor is going up behind the malleolus on the inside of the leg, and then up behind the shin bone and the fibula. In other words, filling in this spot behind the interosseous membrane. This is the deep posterior compartment. If you want to feel it, cross one leg, hold that for a second, cross one leg over the other, and put your thumbs up against the inside of your shin bone here and press against the backside of the shin bone with your thumbs. You will find what is the condition of those muscles under your thumb. Now, not just pressing in, but pressing in and up against the back of the bones. I think you'll find that they're not in the best shape. So a lot of us have ignored this part of our core, and it shows in the condition of those muscles. This line goes up over the back of the knee with the tendon of the popliteus, and then spreads out into the adductors, which go all the way up to the pubic bone. You know that tendon of the adductor longus that you can always see when you're sitting cross-legged watching TV in your underwear. And it also goes up next to the hamstrings in the back to the ischial tuberosity in the form of the adductor magnus. These adductors, as you know, they get underserved in our populations because they really are part of the leg, but these muscles get involved in lots of, in men, I'm being genderist here, but just go with me for a minute. In men, a lot of the frustration of not being able to change the world ends up in these muscles. In women, of course, there are a lot of women who have had unfortunate sexual or medical experiences that have left them really tight, closed, not open, not able to use that musculature between the legs. That has an unfortunate effect on the pelvic floor. We think a lot about the pelvic floor and how it's connected up, but the pelvic floor is connected down also from the pelvic floor that's in here, down by the ischial tuberosity to the inside of the leg here. So the pelvic floor gets affected from above, from below, as well as from above, the way we're more familiar. Of course, the pelvic floor is along the bottom of the pelvis here, and this line continues from that pelvic floor up the front of the spine, but also continues with the psoas complex. I'm a Rolfer, al-salam alaikum, psoas major. Yeah, we get really excited about the psoas, which, let me use the psoas major even though other muscles around here sort of duplicate this run from the lesser trochanter up to the lumbar spine. This is the major guy wire for your lumbar spine. This is the major stabilizing muscle from the front. And this comes up to where? Comes up to the diaphragm. So if we wrap this around like the tail of a snake around the thing, let's call it a cobra, that cobra could come up here behind the guts and then join the diaphragm. Do you see the cobra? I don't know if I can get my hands out of the way enough. This is the hood and the nose of the cobra here, and the body of the cobra is the psoas, and the tail of the cobra is wrapped around the leg. Can you see how breathing is grounded in your legs? Can you see how the relationship that we were talking about between the rib cage and the pelvis when we were talking about the girl from New York who's the karate teacher. If we're going to change the relationship between the respiratory diaphragm and the pelvic diaphragm, we need not only to think about tone in the transversus abdominis, but we need to think of what is the balance in the psoas and the diaphragm. Ida Rolf used to joke with us that the diaphragm is a muscle of walking and the psoas is a muscle of breathing. It took me a long time to turn that from a joke into something that I really use in my practice. The diaphragm is the beginning of walking, the psoas is the root of breathing. Well, that takes us up to here, and unless you're a werewolf or an endothoracic surgeon, you can't touch the fascia inside here. It's inside a sealed system, but I can tell you that from the diaphragm, the force is taken not so much through the lungs, but around the lungs with the pleura, up to muscles here called the scalenes, and the muscles that go up inside the hyoid bone to the top of your gut. Remember when we said gut, the letter G? That's where your gut starts, is right up on the skull underneath here. I think we're going to make a virtue out of this necessity and let that jaw fall so that you can see how this goes all the way up to the very bottom of the skull. It comes behind the hyoid bone. Some of them include the hyoid bone, but in this way we can show you how the deep front line connects the diaphragm to the bottom of the skull. Oh, help, get yourself back together here. That is a tour of the 12 Anatomy Trains lines. There's more to be heard about each one of them and how to body read them. I hope that you'll take the opportunity to come and visit us and see what other things we have on the educational site. For the moment, I just want to thank you very much for listening, thanking you for inviting me to be part of this conference, and to say thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. The Feldenkrais practitioners of the world are making movement, what's impossible possible, what's possible easy, and what's easy elegant. I just love that. I have used what I learned from my Feldenkrais training every day since, even though I did not choose to do that work. And I'm very glad to be able to have this opportunity to present at least some of the fascial idea to you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Wow, that was fantastic, wasn't it? I mean, really, really interesting. I can't wait for the panel discussion in which we get to talk about this. I can't wait to see your comments on this presentation. It was very, very good. So big thanks to Tom and his team for putting that together for us. Also, Tom is offering a follow-up. If you would like to know more about how fascia moves, click on the link below the video, and you will find that you can be tapped right in to a video that will go into greater depth in different ways on the role of fascia and what it does for the human being. So do check it out, and I hope you'll join us for the panel discussion. I hope you'll check out the other presentations in this track of embodied anatomy, and thanks. See you soon.